Welcome to the Freeborn Podcast. I'm here with my special guest, Dr. Robert Murphy. He is a born-again Christian. He has a PhD in economics from New York University. He is a member of the Austrian School of Economics, which we will talk about in a minute. If you're wondering where that school is, then you need to read some of his books to understand what that might be, but we'll talk a little bit about that. He's a libertarian political theorist who specializes in devising nonviolent solutions to social problems. He is an author of numerous economics books for the layperson, including The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism, which I just got done reading a little while ago, a few days ago. Another book named Contra Krugman, Smashing the Heirs of America's Most Famous Keynesian. His latest scholarly book is Choice, Cooperation, Enterprise, and Human Action, which distills the insights of Ludwig von Mises' magnus opus Human Action into an accessible format. He's also the author of Chaos Theory and Lessons for the Young Economist. And both of these books are available as a free download from the Mises.org website, and they also sell hard copies there. If you want to purchase hard copies, you can do so through Mises.org, and also most of his books I found are also available like on Amazon in both digital and hard copy formats. So I'd encourage all my listeners to check those out, especially those of you that are homeschooling. He has a lot of books that really present economics in a very accessible way for young people and for those that might not be up to speed on economics. They're not dry or what you might think of economics books. They're lively and well written. I enjoy reading them, and they have a real good presentation of the subject. And so you can look at that. He's also the host of a popular podcast, The Bob Murphy Show, that you can find on Spotify, iTunes, and probably a lot of other platforms where you might find your podcasts. Welcome, Dr. Robert Murphy. Thank you for being here with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. If you don't mind, Mike, let me just do a disclaimer for the people watching the video. I don't want it to be distracting. I didn't get into a bar fight or something. I had some moles that were being treated, and that's why I have some blemishes on my face at the moment. But that's I don't want people to be looking at it like, what's going on there?
Very good. Well, I really am thankful that you're here, appreciative. Talking to someone like you, an economist, especially of the Austrian school, that's like on my bucket list. So I'm real happy about that. And I really appreciate you making the time for us. Can you tell us a little bit about your testimony as a Christian before we get started? Most of my audience are evangelical or born again Christians, and so I think they'd be very interested in that part of your story.
Okay, sure. So I'll give like this sort of abbreviated version, and then if you want to, ask me follow up, that's certainly I'm happy to do so. So I was raised as a Catholic. My parents were Catholic. I went to Catholic, we call it grammar school, and high school. In terms of the sacraments, I went up through what's called confirmation. But then it was the church I went to. The way I put it is, at least the younger priests, I got the sense from them that they thought the devil was a metaphor, right? Like they and it was mostly like, oh, like try to be good, try to be nice to people, and so like I don't feel like even they believed in the literal truth of the Bible. I think the older priests did, but the younger ones, I didn't get that sense, and so I was I was a very good student, and I got into science, and I realized, quote, realized in quotation marks, this stuff was all nonsense. There's just fairy tales and stuff to have people try to be nice to each other. So I was actually a full-blown atheist by the time I was an undergrad in college, and I actually intended to write a refutation of Christianity because I had read a bunch of stuff like H.L. Mencken's treatise on the gods, and I think his name is George Smith, had a book called Atheism, and I thought, oh, these guys did all right. But in Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, so he wasn't an atheist, but he was a deist, but he didn't like the Christian Bible. He thought it was full of contradictions and silliness. And I thought, I'm going to write the definitive refutation. So I started getting into that stuff. So I'm just showing you where I was.
Sure, yeah. No, this is very fascinating.
And then let's see. But then I went to NYU for grad school, and I had a lot of personal stuff going on, and I reached a crisis point, and I was, I didn't go see somebody about it, but I would have been considered suicidally depressed. And then I just kind of had this epiphany. And I realized like I was causing all my own problems and stuff, and all this stress just flowed out of me. And I had skin problems and things, and I just knew that these like the skin ailments that were just going to just fix themselves. Like I realized, oh, it was the stress doing that. And so I was still an atheist, just to be clear. But then because of that insight and me realizing how much my body like was just going to repair itself, I was like, oh, like it really is true. Like the mind body connection. Like I had thought that was kind of gobbledygook new age stuff up to that point because I was real rational. And
Right.
so once it happened to me personally, I realized, like, well, oh, this is a real thing. And so then I said, oh, so that makes more sense. There was this guy 2,000 years ago walking around. He genuinely thought he was the son of God. He wasn't, because we all know that's crazy. This is my mindset
Right.
now.
Right.
And but then I thought, okay, that makes more sense. Rather than this all just being a myth and people getting killed for this guy that they know is a big fraud, I then thought, okay, given the belief structure those people had at the time, if he's going around, laying hands and healing them or whatever, they could literally be healers. Because especially because like I had skin problems. I was like, oh, so leprosy is probably just 1,000 times what I had. Like that's the way I was.
Sure.
And so I was piece by piece like coming closer to like thinking, okay, I could see how things sort of like the Bible stories really did happen, but they misunderstood because they weren't scientifically trained, and and it was so things like that were bringing me closer. And then and I just had a couple of experiences and things happened, and I kind of got to a point where I said, all right, if one more thing happens, one more sign, then I'll believe there's a God. And I know this might sound goofy to some people, but I go and stick my hands in my pockets, and there was like a $5 or a $10 bill in there. And I know that so what, but I'm just saying, like the way I was at that time, I was very anal retentive. I would not have just had spare money in my pockets. This is not how I was.
Right.
And I had said, if one more thing happens, boom. And you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it was almost like the bare minimum to be like, oh, you know what I mean? Like there wouldn't have been a burning bush. It was like, you just said just one more thing.
Yeah.
And so I did that, and I was like stunned, and I was full of remorse because I had spent my college years trying. A lot of my friends were Christian because I went to Hillsdale
Okay.
College, which there were a lot of.
Sure.
It wasn't a Christian school per se, but there were a lot of religious people there. And I know I was firstly friendly, but I wasn't a jerk about it. But I was trying to convince. I thought I was freeing them. I would try to talk them out of their faith. Unfortunately, I wasn't successful with anybody, and so then I said, I am so sorry, because meaning, oh wow, I realize now you exist, and I've been walking around trying to tell people you don't exist. And I heard a voice in my head say, I forgive you.
Oh wow.
I know, my atheist self would have explained that away and said, well, you had guilt, and so psychologically you had to hear that, you heard a voice. But I'm just telling you, that was not for me. I heard it in my head. And so then at that point I believed in God, but I still wasn't Christian per se. I was doing research on Buddhism and Hindu, all kinds of stuff. And it was like, I'll wrap the story up here, but it was kind of like, it seemed like other traditions, like they would say, okay, the way you deal with suffering is just convince yourself maybe it's not suffering, maybe it's not a bad thing. How do we know? Like it was that kind of a like, and that just didn't make sense to me. And it was like, whereas with Jesus, it was like, yeah, bad things are going to happen, but don't worry, I've conquered the world, sort of. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that made more sense to me. And so I just the more everything, and I realized like, well, no, my whole value system is from the Sermon on the Mount. Everything, and it was just I kept resisting that last little, and so I finally then it was what, April 15th. I'm trying to think, 2002 is when I realized like, no, everything I need is in Jesus, and I accepted him as my Lord and Savior, and that's that's kind of the highlights.
Wow. Well, that's fascinating. That's very, very interesting. Thank you for that. And then so you graduate from eventually you get your PhD, and now you're at the Mises Institute. I just kind of want to skip ahead for time limits, but you're now at the Mises Institute. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and what you do there?
Sure. So Mises, it's named after the economist Ludwig von Mises. He was one of the most important members of what's called the Austrian School of Economics. And then, real quick, what is that? It's, as you alluded to, it's not that we study the GDP in Vienna. It's the school of thought named because the original founders happened to be from Austria, obviously, and the name stuck. So it's a school of, just like there's the Keynesians or the Chicago school. So the Austrian school is its own tradition, and yes, they stress the importance of free markets and and the connection between that and individual liberty and so on. But it is a technical School of Economics, and if you want, in a moment we can get into like what are the differences. But a big thing, why I think the Austrian school is so important in our current times is they have a theory about what causes the business cycle. And if the Austrians are right, the stuff that all the major central banks around the world are doing is just setting us up for more crashes. In other words, what they think is medicine is actually poison. The reason we keep having these huge boom bust cycles is the faulty ideology or framework that central banks are using. And so that's why I think the Austrian school, it's not just a historical curiosity, but it's really important. So the Mises Institute then is a nonprofit organization. It was established in the early 1980s by Lou Rockwell, and the Murray Rothbard was the sort of the economist on staff. He was a professional economist, one of the arguably founding fathers of American libertarianism. Rothbard was, and studied under Mises, or at least went to his seminars when Mises was at NYU. So Mises was in Austria, and then he famously fled the Nazis as they were taking over because he was Jewish and a classical liberal. So that, he had 2 strikes against him. Yeah. Ended up in Switzerland, then came over to NYU, and that's where he's spent the last part of his career. So yes, the Mises Institute, they're based in Auburn, Alabama, is the physical building, but they have a huge web presence. And yeah, it's just making all sorts of thousands and thousands of articles and books online for the public, PDF form, all the classics in the Austrian tradition, and just, free market tradition in general, classical liberalism, just trying to educate the public, because the way politicians get away with pushing horrible policies that impoverish everybody, ironically, even the most vulnerable members of society, the ones that bear the brunt of it, is because the public just doesn't understand sound economics. And so the Mises Institute exists largely to just educate the public in the principles of economic science, so that they can realize that, when a politician comes along and makes promises, that's going to make you poor, and don't support that.
Yes. And then what is your role there?
So I write articles and things for them, commenting on the passing scene. Right now I'm working on, we have specific projects too. So I'm working on a book called Understanding Money Mechanics. So it's sort of like it's in between just pop articles on particular issues, but also not as detailed as like a full normal book treatment. So just taking little issues here and there, like what's the Fed been doing since 2008? What's the Fed been doing since the coronavirus hit? Is it true that banking works the way that they teach in the textbooks? That kind of stuff, because there's lots of controversy. What's MMT? And what does an Austrian have to say about that? These sorts of things, just to get the, for people who are interested in central banking and money, how does Bitcoin work? Things like that. From an Austrian perspective, but it's largely just to be practical. So even people who aren't Austrian, the goal is that even somebody, a college professor teaching money and banking, if a kid came along and said, "Hey, I found this thing at this Mises.org website. Does this look okay?" Would say, "Oh yeah, this looks like accurate. I don't agree with some of the places he goes with it, but yeah, this is all solid stuff. That's how it works." So that's what I'm working on right now, wrapping up that project for them.
Very good.
And then I should say, we also have a master's. They just recently launched a online master's program, so I will be teaching for that also in the fall.
Oh, very good. Through the Mises.
Right, from the Mises Institute. Yeah.
Very nice. Yeah, I'm a pastor of a church, and so of course I'm in a very small pond, so I don't know a lot of churches. I don't mean this to try to be representative of a broad spectrum, but in as far as I know, I'm in a minority in that I emphasize economics in church. I actually teach it in part of Sunday school classes. I'll deal with it in sermons, not overly. I mean, I'm not an economist. I don't pretend to be, but I do think that sound economic principles are important even in church and for Christians, not just in homeschooling but actually to properly understand large portions of the scriptures. I think that sound economic thought is very important. I think that a lot of misinterpretation of the Bible could be cleared up with better economic thought. So that's why I'm very happy when I get a chance to speak to someone like you, because there's not a lot of economists that are also Christians. So
Right,
or
right.
at least outspokenly so, as you are on like Twitter and stuff. So I've often one of the things that I'll like point out to people in the congregation is that if we look at, and I mentioned this to you in our correspondence, but if we look at the parable of Christ of the unjust steward, it always struck me that Christ is lamenting that the children of light are ignorant about the way the world works, and that's how I contextualize what I mean when I teach economics. I'm not teaching the mathematical principles and stuff. For me, economics is the way in which I can understand the world in the biblical sense of the world, the way the power structure of the world is set up. And even if we were to, even as I as a Christian would not want it to be that way, it's the way it is. It's the way it will be until Christ sets up a new order. And I think it's very important for Christians to comprehend that. I don't know if you see it that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, and also too, like him saying you have to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. So I think, yeah, that's great. Like, in other words, you need to know exactly what these, and someone asks him about the king, and he said, well, here's what you go tell that fox, so
Yeah.
he knows full well like what these rascals are up to, and and tells the people. But yes, then the response is we don't play their game, but you need to know what they're doing. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah. And I find it very, very, I also lament that too many Christians seem to have no interest. They seem to be incredibly ignorant on this. And so I'd really encourage those of you that are listening to this in the audience to pick up Robert's books, read up on it. You'll get a much better sense of what's going on in the world, why things work the way they do. And I think it's very important for Christians to do so, especially those that are homeschooling. You got some books that are really good for that, I think.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. Yeah, that lessons for the young economist in particular. That, and as you said to your listeners, they can go get the free PDF. There's for the students version, and it's aimed at like 7th grade through 10th grade, let's say. But there's margins either way depending on your child. And you can get the student version, and then there's also a teacher's manual they're all free PDFs, for the parent to go through, just lesson plans, and here's how you might do a game or something based on these concepts. Because that's what we're trying to give resources for homeschoolers in particular. So I think you're right, and yeah, I don't know if this is partly what you were lamenting, Mike, but that there is among some Christians this notion that, oh, money's dirty, and I don't want to sully myself by because I'm not materialistic. So that's good, right? Yeah, don't be just all about brand names and I want to go buy the latest product that's being pushed on TV or something. But it is important to know, just like you should know how the basics of chemistry and physics, just know how the natural world works. And certainly commerce and money and banking, that's an important part of how the human society works right now. And it's important to understand it. Also, like I said earlier, partly because so much evil that is introduced through the political process only goes through because people lie about this is why we're doing these things, because we want to help these people. And the only way to know that that's not correct, I guess you wouldn't know it's a lie, you could think maybe they just are misinformed, is by understanding economic science.
That's right. So
it looks like if somebody said, oh, we're gonna tax everybody or to do this, and because we're going to send someone faster than light out to Pluto, and that's why we need $1 trillion from everybody. If you knew the basic of physics, you'd say, well, no, you can't do that. So that doesn't make sense. So no, you know
Correct.
What I mean? So,
yes, I do.
Silly analogy, but likewise, say, well, we want to help everybody. That's why we're going to have a minimum wage of $15 an hour to help poor people. If you know the basics of economics, no, that's actually going to hurt poor people. What are you doing?
That's right. That's exactly right. And even if, like you pointed out, I mean, I think a lot of this is being sold on lies. I think a lot of politicians know better. They know that, but they also know that that's what sells, and so they're putting out the product that people want to buy. And telling the truth will probably get them fired, because there's an endless supply of politicians willing to tell people what they want to hear, I think. But then, like you said, there's also those that probably believe it, think that they think, yeah, I love people and I love poor people and I want I think everyone ought to make $15 an hour or whatever. I don't know why they stop there. It seems like they ought to make it $100 or $200. And I mean, why are they so chintzy, right? With the poor people, they ought to just promise them everything.
Right, and also too, like, why do we need to send foreign aid to other countries? Why don't we just send over one guy to go over there and say, here's what you do, enact a minimum wage of $15 an hour, and then you can have our standard of living.
Yeah, there you go.
Problem solved. Why are we giving them money? It's
just
silly.
Export our values instead of our money. Right. And so, and yeah, you're right. And so, but going back to your point you made about money and it being, many Christians seeing it as dirty, that I think you're absolutely right on that. And I think it's a huge mistake. Not only should I think Christians should understand money, I think they should be really good with it, because Christians are the only ones who are going to do real good with it, in my opinion, especially looking at it from a eternal perspective, right? I think there's a lot of people doing good in a worldly perspective who aren't Christians, and they're doing philanthropy, and that's not to diminish from that. But when we look at from an eternal perspective, there's a lot of good that can be done with money. And we find that Jesus was supported by wealthy people. The apostles received offerings from wealthy people. They did a lot of good with that money, not just in philanthropy, but in eternal reward as well. And so when Christians have this view that money in and of itself is evil, they're misunderstanding the scriptures, which don't portray it that way. That's not the point. But then they're also abdicating the good that can be done to those who aren't going to do it. And I think that Christians need to really take hold of economic principles and financial principles, and they need to be the best at money that the world that are in the world, if possible, studying it and being very proficient with it.
Yeah, just to amplify what you're saying, right? I mean, the actual line from the scripture is the love of money is the root of all evil. It's not money, and so I certainly agree with that. Correct biblical sentiment that you don't want to make money an idol. You certainly don't want to base your self-worth on your financial status. That's all clearly true. Mm-hmm. But then I think you're right. Some Christians go too far when they say, "Oh, money, I just didn't want to think about that," and whatever. And if I'm to worry about saving for my future and how I'm going to plan things down the road, and where to keep a careful watch on my investment portfolio, that somehow makes me part of the world, and I don't want to do that. I think that's a mistake. And it's certainly in the Old Testament, you see it's the people, if you do these principles, follow these principles, you'll be prosperous. Your flocks will grow and so on.
Yeah.
And I think nobody would get upset with somebody who used arithmetic to keep track of how many sheep they had.
Right.
And say, oh, no, math is dirty. Because there's a lot of evil people who use math to, calculate their wealth and they're greedy. Like, that would be goofy. No, math is just a tool. And so likewise, money and calculation and using accounting just to keep track of, hey, did the business turn a profit last year? Those are just tools to know if you're husbanding your resources in a proper, responsible manner.
Correct.
And like you say, it's what you do with those resources, and obviously the way you conduct yourself. And so it's certainly, I'm not saying, oh yeah, be ruthless in business 6 days a week and then be nice in church on Sunday. Obviously, that's not what we're saying. But nonetheless, yeah, the mere fact that you turn a profit doesn't mean, oh, you must have done something wrong. It's like, no, actually, in general, and the Austrian tradition stresses this, what it means when you turn a profit is that you took resources that were of a certain value and transformed them into things that your customers liked more. That's what it means to make a profit. You bought at a low price, turned them into something that you sold for more. So, if it's something like turning tobacco into cigarettes, you might say, yeah, I don't think that my customers are doing what's in their own interest, so I don't want to do that line of work. Okay, fine. But in general, the fact that you're taking resources and turning them into something that people value more, that's, other things equal, a good thing.
Right. And that, that was one of the things that I didn't grow up. My family wasn't into economics in any way. I wasn't something that I was like taught or even talked about in my home, really, in that sense. And I ended up started reading Milton Friedman books, and then Thomas Sowell books, and then others. And what drew me to Austrian economics is that it, to me, lines up with the value system of Christianity, in that it is about free enterprise and it's about free choice, and that the only way you really in the long term succeed with that vision is by providing people what is in their best interest, and that serves your interest. and the way it harnesses self-interest and turns it into public good, that really drew me to this whole view of economics that to me is a much better explanation of how the world works. And it's also I think a better view of how we would want the world to work, bar there being a perfect utopia where everyone does only what's better for other people. I find that socialism attempts to implement that utopia, and to do so, they murder everyone who doesn't comply, which is everybody, right? Everybody has self-interest still because we don't have perfect charity in our hearts. And so the only way to fix that for them is to kill everybody. Where this takes what could be a disastrous situation of self-interest and turns it into a public good. So to me, is the system that best explains and best implements the worst parts of our society.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of great points there. I agree with everything you said. Just to add more, so it is. I'm now as we're sitting here talking about it, I would try to put my finger on what is the reason for the affinity, because the developers largely of Austrian economics were not Christian. They were ethnically Jewish, and I think they were either agnostic or outright atheist. I'm not sure what terms they would use for like Mises himself, Murray Rothbard. Rothbard's wife was a staunch Catholic, though, and that was interesting. Ayn Rand didn't like that. She told Rothbard, "What are you doing? Being married to someone who's so irrational?" So that was kind of a funny little anecdote. But nowadays, for sure, I mean, the circles I travel, if I go give a talk or whatever, there's plenty of Bible-believing Christians who are just drawn to the Austrian school of economics, and they can just tell that, oh yeah, this is it. And so I guess part of it would be, and what's the distinction between that versus other schools of thought that give a quote scientific framework for how a technocrat can run society much better than, oh, look at this anarchy. We have all these people doing this wasteful, so let's just get rid of that and just get some real smart guys in the room, and women too, and they can plan the economy, and we'll just do things better. Just the hubris involved with that. Like, I think the Austrian school is more like, this is for people who know humans are fallen and that we have to be careful about unbridled power and the temptations of things like this is a framework that's well suited to that recognizes how people are in reality. So again, I want to stress, it is a scientific approach. You know what I mean? It's not like that Austria would say, okay, we want the answer to be limited government or no government intervention, so how do we get there, even though that's what some of the critics disparage it as. But in my mind, because of its framework does line up with that, that's why it rings true to them and say, yep. Like I'll go just give talks to people about what caused the housing boom and bust, and then I'll be done, and I'll have people come up to me and say, I hated economics in college, whereas what you just did, that was amazing, and like I understood what you were saying and it totally made sense. So I think normal people get this stuff because it is common sense. Things like, yeah, if you want to get richer in society, you have to save more. It's not that, oh, the way to fix the economy is the government has to go run a $4 trillion deficit. That doesn't make any sense, right? But yet that's what the economists at MIT and Harvard are saying.
Yes.
Is that, oh yeah, the way we're in the economy's up against the ropes right now, so what we need is for the government to spend money like a drunken sailor. That's the way. Or people are just saving too much. Too bad. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And the Austrians have a framework in which your common sense is validated.
Yes. Yeah. I look at it and I see that the Austrian view lines itself up best with the truth of how the world works and everybody's experience practically. And it dispels ideas that anybody who is acting in self-interest within the rules, within the rule of law, within the rule of business, is somehow evil. Because if you watch a Hollywood movie, I can't remember the last time I saw one where the evil villain wasn't the CEO of a major corporation. It's always the villain, and the government official is always the hero who saves everybody. And that is it's such a silly paradigm. And when you look at economics from this perspective, it's almost flipped around the other way, where it's not that the CEO is a hero, but the business realizes that if they're going to get money, it's going to be because people voluntarily give it to them because they provide them a service. Walmart didn't get rich because they were stiffing everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Right. And so that's yes, that dovetails exactly with what I was saying earlier about how, this, and it's not just the Austrians, but just generally like you call it the free market tradition, or,
sure.
A lot of what insights from even the classical economists, but yes, realizing that there are, greedy people out there, or especially like certain, high achieving men who just, they want to beat their rivals, whether it's in sports or whatever.
Sure.
And so in the setting of the business world, in a laissez-faire capitalist system with enforcement of property rights, right? What do? They're up at night thinking, how can I give a better product to my customers at a lower price than my competitors are doing? Like
that's right.
They're trying to serve their customers better. Whereas in a political system, it's more, how do I dupe more people? How do I get more votes? How do I do this? To take more money from one group to promise it to another. So it's just very adversarial. And so you're right. The problem in those popular Hollywood movies or whatever, it's not so much that they're casting CEOs as being ruthless, do whatever it takes to win. Okay, sure. But then why do you assume the people that go into government and they want to become governor at all costs, and then I want to go to Senate, and then I want to become sort of like that scene in The Godfather where Kay says, yeah, but the senators don't have people killed, and he's like, now who's being naive, Kay? So just the point is, be consistent. That, there's power hungry, ruthless people that go into the business world. Why would you assume everybody in political office is the angel they pretend to be on TV?
Yeah, exactly. And you could also say that, when they make sports movies, I mean, people playing in the NBA, they're ruthless. I mean, within the rules, they're trying to decimate their opponent. They're not trying to, help him score a basket, or, they're trying to win. And we look at that and we cheer. We think that's great. We love this competition. It provides a better product to the consumer, who's the person watching the game. And so we're all happy about that. When you look at business, so long as it's within the legal rules of, respecting property rights, as you say, and such on, well, then that competition provides a better product to their consumers, I think.
Right. And the irony there is, I'm sure, some, maybe not your listeners per se, but a skeptic who heard our conversation here would say, oh, right, but the problem is in the business world, those rules aren't enforced, and the businesses do get away with, selling bad products, mislabeled and I said, right. And so in that framework, then which agency is the one that says we're in charge of making sure businesses play by the rules? It's the government. And so even on their own terms, if they're saying the businesses, the CEOs and whatever, they cheat and whatever, and they rip off their employees, and they give mislabeled products or whatever to their customers, then the fault is not with the people playing within that system. It is the alleged referees or the umpires. And so again, the problem goes back to the government's not doing the job that it said it was going to do. So again, this is the kind of thing where it would be like, yeah, in professional sports, if someone went up and just started taking a knife out and knifing people when they're going up to lay up the ball, that wouldn't be good. And we could also, but that wouldn't persist in the NBA because the fans would know that's crazy. I don't want to watch a game like that, and so the refs wouldn't let that.
Yes.
There's claims that they would, Michael Jordan might have pushed off a little bit on one of those, iconic game-winning shots, but Jordan didn't just pull back and punch the guy in the face. They would have called him for an offensive foul, right?
Yeah.
So
they were playing within the margins of the rules,
right? Whereas there are things like, for example, Bernie Madoff. There were private watchdog groups that knew he was running a Ponzi scheme, and one guy for years was sending warnings to the SEC and whoever else the relevant, regulatory authorities would have been, saying these numbers he's publishing, this is a Ponzi, this can't be right, and they didn't care.
Yes.
And yet that's held up now as just the epitome of look at how laissez-faire capitalism fails you. When no, it was the government agencies who tell everybody we're in charge, don't worry, we're on the job, that then we're asleep at the wheel.
Yes. Yes, very good. How would I put it? So that lines up with something I wanted to talk to you about also, which is the idea of regulations. The problem that a lot of the economists I read point out with regulatory bodies is that they are very quickly usurped by the large players in the market, who then turn them into their way of getting preferential treatment, which was something that one of the first things that when I read Friedman especially, he points that out a lot, and it was like opened my mind to realizing that this cry for regulation whenever something goes wrong, we don't real it. At the beginning, it's like, oh, somebody did some company did something terrible. We need to regulate that, and we think that's going to fix it. The problem is that the large corporations have enormous resources to turn that regulation actually into a tool that benefits them. And then it becomes a government that is actually enabling, it seems, the bad behavior that we find in these companies, as opposed to, being the ref, let's say, in the game.
Right. So the term that's used in this context is called regulatory capture. And so, yes. And so the problem is, as you say, that they have these, like the FDA oversees the pharmaceutical companies, the Federal Reserve oversees the banks. And that one is in particular is interesting because the banks literally are owners of the Federal Reserve, like legally they own stock in it and get, so it's.
See, people don't realize that. Could you say that again? I don't know that most people pay attention, right, to this stuff closely, but why don't you explain that a little bit more so people can understand the impact of what that statement actually means?
Right. So if you go, this is all on the Federal Reserve's website. This isn't like some conspiracy theory. The Federal Reserve, it's this weird, it's not just an agency like the IRS or the FDA. It is a quasi-private public agency entity that is literally owned like by private sector banks. Like they are shareholders in the Federal Reserve, and the Fed, in terms of, it receives revenues every year, and it legally pays out dividend payments to its shareholders, who are the banks that it is itself overseeing. So people shouldn't read too much into that, because it's still true that the political process appoints the head of the chairperson and all that stuff of the Fed. So I mean, the decisions that the Fed makes are not purely driven by them, but I do think people need to realize, like, that's a weird setup where the banks who are being regulated by the Fed literally own it. So, but just more generally, when you think through, okay, so like the FDA, in order for them to regulate the pharmaceutical companies, they have to have people on staff who know about that industry, right? And so what ends up happening in practice is people come from industry, have decades of experience, worked at Pfizer or wherever, and then they are going to be the experts on staff with the FDA, making judgments about perhaps, the place where they used to work and whether they're going to approve something or not. And so the issue is that's kind of unavoidable. You couldn't have it that people regulating an industry know nothing about it, right? Because then that would be crazy.
Right.
I'll give you an example in a second of like the absurdities that can happen. But then, of course, it sets up the possibility of corruption. And so and then another element of it too is people in the government positions that by their discretion can have huge economic impacts on private sector companies. They can, do them favors, and then when they're out of office, they can get nice consulting jobs. And so, it's not a literal, hey, here, we'll give you this money right now while you're empowered to rule favorably. That would be corruption, and, they'd go to jail. But this more general process of, hey, he's a good guy, and then later he's going to get, just like looking at like Bernanke now, Ben Bernanke, who's, chair of the Fed, he's got nice positions where he's a blogger for some place and earns a big salary. And, was it literally a phone call made at 6 o'clock in the morning one day that said, hey, if you rule this way, then we're maybe not, but you can see how there's that temptation for corruption. And so just Mike, to give you an example of what I mean, how these regulations, they have to, have some acknowledgement of reality. So under the George W. Bush administration, they put in place an ethanol mandate that had a schedule saying over time, more and more gallons of ethanol have to get mixed into the nation's fuel mix. But then the financial crisis hit in 2008, and economic, activity dropped, and people weren't driving as much, and so forth. And so what ended up happening was the amount of ethanol that was supposed to go into the fuel mix was going to be so, because they didn't do it as a percentage, they did it as absolute gallons every year, because they just did projections of, well, if automobiles or if driving keeps going up, then, but then because of the thing they weren't expecting. And so what ended up happening is the existing mandate would have required so much ethanol to get mixed in that the refiners and the gas, the people selling the gas, they would have been violating another part of federal law saying you can't put in too much because it'll ruin the engine. And so it was like, the refiners, they literally, no matter what they did, they would be breaking the law. And so it was things like, so they got some exemptions and things, but that's the kind of thing I mean, where they do have to have like these review processes, and then industry can come and complain and say, wait a minute, you're proposing this regulation. Have you thought about X, Y, Z? So that's what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah.
they need to have people on staff who know how industry works. Otherwise, they could have mandates that are just insane. But then you have the problem of what's called the revolving door, where people work in industry, then they go work and regulate their own buddies. One last example is Henry Paulson, who was the Treasury Secretary in the George W. Bush administration. We used to be with Goldman Sachs, and so there was a lot of concern that he was making decisions that hurt Sachs competitors and things. So that's the kind of thing where are you really going to be able to rule against your buddies that you worked for for 20 years?
It certainly does have an appearance of evil to it when you look at it, even if it isn't, even if the ones doing it are, their intentions are pure and and everything they're doing is right, it doesn't look right. And that's a problem with the whole regulatory system that's set up, is that where, like you say, where are you going to get the regulators? And you get them from the industry, and then they've worked somewhere. And then if they make any ruling that is beneficial to whoever they work for, it just has a bad look to it. And that, it seems to me, that devolves into people losing confidence in the government and in the whole process to begin with.
Right. And as you say, it also, just to elaborate too, so I have a book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and New Deal. And so there, part of the issue that, under the New Deal policies is they had industry codes. There's like the National Recovery Act and so forth. They had these codes where, in their mind, they were saying, oh, we got to have fair prices, right? Because we can't just have businesses undercutting each other, because then everybody nobody can turn a profit, and they got to lay workers up. And so they had these like standards set in place. But what that meant in practice was the industry leaders would get together, and then they would set quality and price standards that they could achieve because they were the industry leaders. But then the mom and pop shops couldn't compete, right? So like if you wanted to sell tires, and in our day, like Goodyear tires, the name brand, and they have all kinds of distributors around the country. Everyone knows what it is, so they can charge a higher price. But if you're just some mom and pop tire dealer out in Cincinnati somewhere, the only way you can compete is by charging a lower price. And yet that was made illegal under these codes, under the New Deal. And so you can see that, was that really just about helping the economy, or was it also about forming cartels? And that's part of the problem.
Right, and that lines up with the criticism that Austrian economics has against like minimum wage. It's essentially the same thing, right? That somebody who doesn't have the, let's say, the brand, doesn't have the skills to command $15 an hour, is told basically by the government that it's illegal for a company to hire you.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's something too, that it's funny on that one. It's hard to get people. So I should acknowledge there are like professional economists with peer-reviewed journal articles that question, the empirical impact. Oh, maybe we could raise the minimum wage a little bit and it wouldn't cause drastic unemployment. So, there is that debate. But in terms of the man on the street, and when you online, people are arguing about this, the reason people support hiking the minimum wage is, in their mind, oh yeah, it's just a matter of power, and the businesses have all this extra money, and and so it's sort of like, I want to say to them, if your worldview is correct, why doesn't everybody earn the minimum wage?
That's right.
I mean, if businesses can just pay people the bare minimum that they can get away with to survive, and there's no such thing as competition, and it's not the case that a worker who's really worth $20 an hour is going to get offers and be able to go to someone who's willing to pay them what they're worth. Why isn't just about everyone earning the minimum wage?
Yeah.
When in fact most people earn well above the minimum wage, right? And so once you answer that, you realize, oh, because there is this mechanism that somebody who really is worth $18 an hour, businesses pay that. And so then, if that's the case, then okay, the people right now who are only earning $7.25 an hour, they just, for various, and we can push it back and say, well, why is that? Are the schools bad? Are they not learning skills? Are they in a high crime area? And we can try to deal with those root causes. But fact of the matter is, boom, right now, when all is said and done, this person, this worker, a business knows, if I hire this person, they're only going to bring in let's say $8 an hour of extra revenue for the firm or for the restaurant or whatever it is. So the government says you have to pay them $15 an hour. The government's not forcing you to hire the person. They're saying if you hire them, you have to pay them $15 an hour. And if they're only bringing in 8, why would you be losing $7 an hour on this person? You're not running a charity. And so it's that basic, disconnect that I think a lot of people don't see. And, once you realize things like that, yeah. And like you say, the corrupt element of this is, which groups in society benefit from outlawing cheap labor? It's the labor unions, right? That because they represent the skilled workers who make well above minimum wage. But, someone's like a construction site or whatever, you can go with one group, certain jobs like carpenters where you need high skilled labor, but other things you could get away with hiring a larger number of lower skilled workers being overseen by a foreman or something. And so a union, if they can make it just literally illegal to undercut them, and no, you got to earn at least $15 an hour, that's effectively removing some of their competition. So politically, I think that's partly why some of these politicians are, in favor of these bills, even though when they tell the public, they wouldn't say, oh, it's because we want to outlaw cheap competition for labor unions. They would say, we want to help everybody get $15 an hour when, like we say, in a certain, high crime, poor area, all you're doing is guaranteeing that the fast food place is going to have kiosks and like 2 people with the mic, with the headset on running around, and like maybe they're like in their 30s rather than having 20 teenagers doing odd jobs here and there because the teenagers aren't worth $15 an hour.
Exactly. No, that I agree completely with that, and I think that's another point that many people misunderstand. What I try to get people to understand when I deal with this, because I was a missionary in Mexico for like 30 years, and they implement all these rules like minimum wage and all that to the degree that America would like to, that the Democrats would like to in America. So it's very interesting to see what the outcome of those policies are when they are implemented to that degree, which is, if you ever, I don't know if you are familiar with Mexican labor law and how that works, but it's extremely tilted to the labor. It's right on the verge of outright socialism. And so you get to see what the outcome of these things are. And what I explained to them when I would, especially in Mexico, is that what they don't really tell you is that the real minimum wage is zero. Unless you're going to force the government to hire people, then the actual minimum wage is always zero. They can always just not hire you, and then you have no income.
What's funny is there was, I can't find it anymore, but I saw this great interview. This guy who was sort of like an ambush journalist, and he had a sit-down interview with I'm pretty sure it was Nancy Pelosi. It was some big female Democratic politician. I think it was Pelosi, but I might be getting mixed up. And he was asking her about her support for the minimum wage, and she's and explaining, we can't have these businesses paying less. And then he kind of like let that die down. And then he asked her about, so how do you have things in Washington here? And you have an internship program? She said, oh, yeah. And how much do you pay your interns? Oh, well, no, we don't pay them because it's the valuable work experience they get. And then he was lightly bringing up, the connection to what she just was demonizing the businesses for paying less than $7.25, and it was pretty good.
That is good. That is funny. One thing is interesting also, going back to, when I deal with people in Mexico, there's of course the immigration issue. A lot of them want to come to the States to work, and I'll talk to them about that and point out that that coming to the States, they'll have no protections because they'll be here illegally, right, without papers, and so they don't fall under minimum wage laws. They don't fall under any of the protections that we think that poor people should fall under. And you ask them, would you rather work in Mexico with all the protections that the Mexican government offers, which is, like I say, it's just it's mind-boggling what they protect them. In Mexico, an employee is under the care of the employer the moment he steps out of his house to go to work. So if your employee steps out of his house and gets hit by a bus, that's on you, the employer, even though he wasn't at work. And you care for him until he gets back home again that night, till he walks into his house. He is under your liability for the whole time. So you have that system in Mexico, or come to the States where you have zero protections whatsoever from anybody. Where would you rather work? And they all would say in the U.S. with no protections at all, with no minimum wage, no health care, nothing that they have. They would still rather work here. And my point to them is, it's not minimum wage that is that is lifting you up. It's working in a better economy and furthering your skills. And not that none of them get abused here, but they realize that there is tremendous potential without any protections.
Right, and the fundamental driver of that is that our system, for various reasons, the legal framework, but also, just the tools and equipment and things that we have, the infrastructure, their manual labor is more physically productive in the U.S. system than it is in the Mexican one. And so since there's more there, that's why they can, employers in the U.S. can afford to pay them a higher take-home wage than what they're going to get in Mexico. And so just a different example, the kind of thing you're talking about, that there's in places like in Spain and France, there's, quote, more protections for the worker. And, in other words, once you get hired, it's a lot harder to get fired from a job like in Spain or France than it is the United States. And so people like pro-labor groups like that kind of stuff, right? Oh, protection. But then the unemployment rate, particularly among young people, is sky high in those places compared to here. And so, see, why is that? And again, just thinking from the employer's point of view, they know once I hire you and you're on my books, if you turn out to be a bad worker, I can't get rid of you.
That's exactly like Mexico.
Right. And so you want to be a lot more careful on the front end. And this is also why, to use a different example, the so-called Family Leave Act, there's things like that where people, advocates will have talking points like, I'm making this up, but it's stuff along the lines of, the U.S. is the only industrialized country that doesn't have mandated paid leave for maternity leave and da-da-da. And so I try to tell people, okay, well, let's exaggerate it. Why don't they just say, if you have a full-time job as a woman and then you have a baby, you get 3 years of paid time off, and the employer has to buy you a brand new SUV because you got to run to the store and get diapers and stuff. Now you need a bigger vehicle. Why don't we do that?
Yes.
Do you think that would make employers more or less likely to want to hire a 22-year-old woman who's married?
Exactly.
Right. And so, and they'll say things like, oh, well, it's illegal to discriminate against women. They won't even acknowledge what the issue is. They'll just say, well, we've got some other law that fixes that. So yeah. So anyway, it really is. They just refuse to see these issues and to know, like, yeah, you can get mad at God for making women the one that bear children. Okay. But that is the reality. And if you're an employer and if this lady gets pregnant, then I have to pay her for a year, even though she's not working for me. That's an extra liability, and you have to take that into account. So if that means you either would pick a man who's similarly qualified or a woman who's unmarried, and you have the sense that she's not, she doesn't want to have a family, or you would pay less to compensate for the fact that there's a chance if she's going to take this leave, and so for her career I got to break even at least, and so I can't pay her as much. And then people look at the disparity in salaries and say, oh, there's rampant sexism in the U.S.
Yes. And you know what happens in Mexico, and I think this is what we'll see if they implement these rules, I would think, but you can correct me. But what happens in Mexico is, so, they have all that situation you've just laid out, this deal with, you have a woman and they have all these paid leaves, and that's all required in Mexico. So what happens there is that because of the laws that say that she has to be paid the same as everyone else, no matter what, well, then everybody's wages are depressed. People look at Mexico and wonder, why is it that people make such little money in Mexico? And that's why, because all the onerous rules requiring employers to provide all these benefits, right, that's get factored in. And so then that's part of their wages. And so their actual take-home pay is very little. But then they have to pay everybody that has the same job description has to be paid identical amount. And their idea is that means that women or young people or whoever or old people or whoever it is that's a lower paid group is going to get their salaries, that's going to raise them. But what happens is it lowers everybody's salary, which then you lose the talent that you had in the company because they don't want to work for that little. And so there's this huge talent drain out of Mexico into the United States because they can't make what their talent deserves, because then the company will have to raise everybody's wages to that level. So then the wages are depressed and talent is just, draining right out of the country.
Yeah, that's a great point, that a lot of these regulations, they assume if they mandate an equality that it will lift up the people who are below the cutoff to the average, when no, it could be the other way around. And so I'm not familiar with the particulars in the Mexican situation, but what you're saying totally, makes sense to me. And also too, depending on like the actual, rules that are in place, like you could see things that, okay, so yeah, the way that would work out in practice is that the people who have way higher productivity and can't be getting paid that, quote, the same wage, then they would have an instance like they might leave the company and start their own company and then
That's
pay
right.
themselves, you know what I mean? Or they could be an independent contractor. And so maybe technically what the Mexican firm is doing, it doesn't have men and women on staff doing the same job but paying the men more for the reasons you said it. Instead, now they hire some outside contractor. And so it's like, oh no, we're not paying men different wages. We're just paying, Acme company $6,000 a month for these services to come in and clean out to empty the garbage or whatever. And they happen to be men. And then if you looked at the Acme's books, the men would be getting paid more than the women in this original firm, but technically they're different firms. And so
Yes.
it's not obvious they're breaking the law. Weird things like that can happen that are just, more inefficient.
Yeah. And this goes back to what we were talking about originally, in that I looked at the Austrian School of Economics when they started, and one thing that resonated with me is the humility that I think it displays to say there are infinite ways that humanity is going to, like water, flow around all these rules and regulations and pursue things. Whereas I look at the other views of economics, and they have this idea that if we figure it out and make a rule, everything's going to work out the way we want it to. Whereas the Austrians say no. Basically, it seems to me, anyways, that's how I read it, is that it's more of a view of that there are so many things that we can't foresee, but we do know that what's going to happen is humans are going to flow through all these gates and around them, and so it's better to work with their nature as opposed to against it. I don't know if I'm explaining myself very well, though.
Oh, you're exactly right, and I mean that's a rich tradition in the free market camp of what you're saying. Friedrich Hayek talked a lot about this. One of the famous members of the Austrian school, won the Nobel Prize. This hubris, this planning mentality, this idea that we're the smart technocrats, we know better, and if we just lay down the law, like literally the legislation, and if it doesn't work out, well, we'll just tweak it, and if we need to, if people aren't obeying, well, we just got to up the punishment, to get them to comply, and as opposed to let's be more humble and figure out, okay, what are we missing? Why are people doing things this way? Just like nowadays, people look and they see statistically men tend to earn more than women. And so most people just automatically, well, that's because of sexism. Whereas a more, humble approach would and acknowledging that maybe we don't know things, would be say, well, let's do some more research and figure out why is this? And then, you start unpacking it and realize, oh, well, in general, men tend to work longer hours. And in general, men don't take breaks in their career as much, and they work, if you adjust for the danger of the job, certain occupations are more dangerous, they get paid higher accordingly, and for whatever reason, men tend to be in those occupations more than women. And when you look at stuff like, if you do a truly apples to apples, like a never married PhD in the same field, women get paid more than men if you have them on an equal footing like that, right? And so, is there sexism against men now? But so anyway, it's things like that.
Yes.
Where it's people just they're lazy about it, and they just are quick to go to what explanation fits in their framework, their worldview, and rather than trying to figure out, like, let me go investigate and be agnostic in the beginning because maybe I just don't know.
Right. Very good. I want to get back and ask you about regulation. I want to give you an example. I was listening to I can't think of what she is right now, but her name is Dr. Shana Swan. She I can't think of the name of the field she's in. Anyway, she studies phthalates and what they're coming out of plastics into food. These estrogens that are coming into food, and so she has she wrote a book on the falling sperm counts and all these things, which I'm looking into and reading, and some of what she says is frightening, the ideas of it, if it's true. But one of the things that was interesting when I was listening to all that is she was on this podcast, and like both her and the host, their immediate response was, well, we just need regulations. We just got to regulate this because it's a public health issue, and the government needs to clamp down. And I'm not sure what those regulations they think might look like no plastic. I don't know if they realize how I'm sure she does, but I'm not sure the host realizes just what they're talking about, the extent of that. But what you as coming from the Austrian economic school, what would be, how could this something like that, assuming all that she says is true, how could that be handled if it isn't with this top down regulatory burden being put on?
Sure. So, I think the main thing is to educate consumers, and so that they would understand those issues. And then if it really is a problem, and more and more customers are concerned about it, then it would be like the road retailers would, I think, be like the first line of defense. And so they would, so it's not that each consumer would have to go do research on every little product and see what's in there, but so long as 5-10% of the consumers really did care strongly about it, well, then Walmart and other major food chains and so would know that, oh, we don't want to carry products by this brand because we know there's been this link. And I think part of the problem with going with the regulatory state approach is people just assume, they don't bother worrying about food product safety, because they have this idea that, well, if it were really unsafe, the government wouldn't have allowed it. So if I go into the store and something's on the shelf, it has to be safe because we have the FDA. When in fact, as you're saying, that's not correct. And there's all kinds of examples with Vioxx and things like that, where the FDA, there was stuff up there on the marketplace that was known to be dangerous, and it took years for the FDA to reverse itself. So again, there's nothing magical about experts going to work for the government, right? It doesn't make them more able to detect problems with food quality or drug quality. And so the issue is just the system and the incentives. And in fact, when the FDA screws up, they get more money, right? They can go to Congress and say, we're understaffed, we need more money. And so that's kind of a weird system where if you're doing your job and there's no problems, your funding stays the same. If some major disaster happens, yeah, the people at the top might lose their jobs, but the agency itself is going to get more funding because, can you imagine Congress cutting the budget of the FDA after there was some major pharmaceutical problem?
Yeah, like penalizing them, right? Or
right.
Punishing. It almost sounds like they're rewarding them. You point that out in your book on politically incorrect capitalism. Mm-hmm. I'm not getting the title right, but
the politically incorrect guide to capitalism.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. You point that, and you also make the point in there, and you alluded to it right now. But to me, I'd like to emphasize it because I haven't actually heard it from anyone else. I don't know if it's unique to you, but I hadn't read it before. But to me, it was like eye-opening, because the complaint or the criticism that I often hear against the more laissez-faire view of regulation or of that is the criticism is, well, the average person doesn't have the time to investigate every single product and every single service and to be able to have that decision. They got to live their life, so they need. And the point you make in your book on capitalism, the politically incorrect guide to capitalism, is that that's a misunderstanding of what Austrians are actually proposing. They're not proposing that every person be an expert on everything, but rather that the market incentivizes, for instance, in this case, let's say Walmart, to provide products that aren't going to kill their customers. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And they're highly incentivized to keep their customers alive.
Right, exactly. So, for example, what if you go buy a lamp from Walmart and you come home and you plug it in and it electrocutes you or it blows up or something, right? That would be very bad for business. And so, yes, it's not that every customer, when they're going and they see the product on the shelf at Walmart, they need to pull out their smartphone and go to Consumer Reports or whatever and check it out. I mean, some do that. That's, they do the research before they buy products, especially expensive ones. But the average customer doesn't need to do that because Walmart's team, before, when they're working with, a distributor from China or wherever, they're going to do safety testing or go look at independent auditors to make sure, because they know it's going to be horrible for business if one customer, even just one time in the country, dies because we had sold them a product. That's terrible for business. And so they have an incentive not to do that. Now, it's true. People would say, oh, I don't trust that. That's too weak of an incentive structure. But let me just flip it on its head. The people who say, oh, not enough consumers are going to do the research and care one way or the other. Okay, right. But then by the same token, when we just had the election between Trump and Biden, did a lot of people vote based on the regulation of lamps bought from China and which Walmart carried because of Trump and Biden's respective positions on safety inspector? You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
for some reason, they assume that no, in the political process, the voters care enough to go do the research to then cast their votes accordingly to make sure the right people get in charge of these inspection regimes. When no, that doesn't happen at all. Whereas
Right.
at least with the Walmart, like it's more decentralized, is what I'm getting at, is so that whatever the due diligence is on the part of the general public, that is much more effectively focused if it's a decentralized system, and where they're going to go complain to Walmart or whoever sold the shoddy product, and they're going to bear the brunt of it. Whereas if it's just it's just the system, the political system, you know what I mean? There's 1,000 different issues people care about in an election, whether it's for president or governor or mayor. And the fact of regulating lamps bought from China, there's no, that's going to get lost in the shuffle. And so again, with all this stuff, it's sort of like going back to the issue of, our CEOs cutthroat and greedy, yes, but so are people who go into politics. And so it's not that you solve the problem by just turning it over to the politicians and let them handle it. The same thing here. So yeah, there is an issue that the general public is not qualified and can't be expected to spend their time researching every last product detail in terms of safety. You have to defer that to, outsource that to other experts. But then in terms of the system, what system has the incentives that's more likely to contain error? And like you say, when someone does screw up, do they get punished or do they get a bigger budget? If a lamp that Walmart sells blows up, more people are going to buy lamps from Lowe's or Home Depot or whatever, at least for a few months while the story's fresh.
Correct.
So at least Walmart is going to get immediate punishment, whereas in the political process, if, like I say, if the FDA approves something that turns out, caused a bunch of heart attacks and they reverse themselves, it's not even obvious that anyone's going to get in trouble for that.
Yeah, no, and their view, the standard view seems to be that, well, their intentions were good, right? Whereas like you say, Walmart not only will lose the sale of lamps, they'll lose the sale of everything they have, because a customer who's been burned by the store isn't going to buy anything from them. I mean, I got stores I won't go by because I don't like how they treated me, or I don't like the product they sold me, or how they handled a refund, a return, or whatever. And so I just banned the entire store, and they start losing money. I don't think consumers realize, because they're sold as bill of goods, it seems to me, that these major corporations can do anything they want, when in fact they live very precariously, I think, on the edge of the knife, because they can go out of business actually very easily. Very, very easily.
Right. And especially when it comes to like grocery stores and things, like the margin, the profit margin is razor thin. Like I think people have this idea that, oh yeah, grocery stores mark their prices up 20-30%. No, it's pennies, on the dollar at best. And so, yeah, a lot of these stores, it's razor thin margins. The other thing too, I want to stress is, in case, some of your listeners like, yeah, what you guys are saying in theory could work. Well, come on, I just know that right now, the reason some of these mechanisms we're talking about aren't that potent is, again, because people just assume, no, I don't have to do research because the government's looking out for me. And so if you really didn't have that, if there were no pretense that the FDA has approved everything, don't worry, it's safe, and people did more due diligence, and they might not, buy a product from a pharmacist unless it had a stamp on it saying, like, this independent group has verified this, or vouches for the authenticity or the purity of this particular product or whatever. So I'm saying there's just like there's the UL, Underwriters Laboratory, if people are familiar with that. So certain electrical products, when you buy them, like an extension cord, you can turn it over and look, and there's the UL stamp on that. So that's, private agency that says we've tested this thing and we approve it. So I'm saying that mechanism could be more broadly used, but the reason right now it's not used so much is because people think it'd be redundant because the government's keeping us safe. And so, partly that's part of the issue is people don't rely on private watchdog groups so much because they assume, everything's basically got to have this standard of safety. And so if that's incorrect, which in many cases it is, like you're saying with these plastics seeping into the products or whatnot, that, they would be more potent.
Correct. I want to ask you quickly about, or ask you about another thing, and that is, it seems to me, and this is where I'm at a conundrum with how I understand how economics works and should work, and how it seems to things are changing. And I want you to tell me if you think it is, if I'm understanding it wrong, or what's going on. So I look at the idea of the free market, and it seems to me the prerequisite of a free market is people acting in their own interest. If everyone wanted everyone else to only succeed, I think capitalism would break down. It not necessarily would be bad if everyone acted in everyone else's best interest. But the way the capitalistic system seems to be set up, it seems to me is that it's based on me pursuing what's best for me, and that means providing you a great service so that you'll then voluntarily give me your money, to put it simply. But when I look at the way corporations seem to be acting right now, especially the large ones, it doesn't seem like they're pursuing their best interest at all. When the NBA and the Oscars and all these major corporations and big businesses seem to be making decisions that alienate large percentages of their customer base. Is that what's happening, or what's going on here with this woke? We call it the go woke, go broke idea. Mm-hmm. And it seems like some companies are actually seem fine with like cutting off 40% of their customer base.
Right. So that's a great question. So I'll throw out some thoughts. So the quick answer is I'm not sure exactly what's driving that. So I mean, I can give some guesses, but I don't know in terms of like how much weight to put on each of these possible factors.
Sure.
So I'm not sure like what the issue is or what's the cause of it, but I think there's some contributing things. So just the broader framework, I think it was Milton Friedman had a famous essay on this, where he was saying just in general, how like even before the extreme woke stuff, just in general, corporations saying stuff like, oh, and we'll donate such and such percent of our profits to, Save the Forest Fund or whatever, or to child leukemia efforts and da 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 da. And so Friedman's take was that no, really, what you want to do as a corporation is maximize value for the shareholders, give them, as much profit as you can, and then they can go and donate that money to whatever cause they want. So it's not that we're anti-charity. It's just that, the function of a car company is to make great cars and then give the dividends to the shareholders of the company, and you go donate to the rainbow. And the reason that's more efficient is, how do you choose which charity to donate to? In other words, maybe the shareholders, some of them like Save the Rainforest, and some of them think, no, malaria nets for Africa. That's the way to go. That's that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's, a general sort of free market position is corporations should not be engaging in, that kind of thing. So now why in practice though do they do it? Well, one thing is just publicity. And so not everybody thinks like Milton Friedman. The average person, if they see, they're watching a movie and the previews in the beginning, and Coca-Cola says that it cares about the environment or whatever, or here at BP we're working to contain oil spills and and we've done. It makes them feel better, and it's just good press. All right, so there's that kind of thing. But then you're right, now with the more woke stuff, I think some of it is usually it's the left that organizes boycotts and stuff. And historically, that's been the case. And so it's kind of like if we've got 2% of our customer base who's going to absolutely flip out and just cause us headaches and boycott us or whatever, and the other 98%, they have jobs, they're taking their kid to soccer, but they don't care one way or the other. Let's keep that 2% happy. And yeah, the other 98%, they might roll their eyes when they see us do messaging talking about Rosa Parks or whatever, when you're saying, what does that have to do with Coca-Cola? But so I think that was part of it. That historically, that's why they just tried to keep, the left-wing activists placated. And then especially now with the Black Lives Matter movement, when it was getting more and more like activists were organizing lists of companies that's saying these companies have not signed on and pledged BLM stuff and organizing boycotts. You could see why defensively they were doing that. But then you're right, now I think it's starting to tip the other way, where because Glenn Beck and Matt Walsh and all these people and Mike Jackson are letting their listeners know, hey, did you know Coca-Cola's saying be less white, and now they're starting to get pushed back from the other way. So I think that's an element too. And the other thing that I can't say how relevant this is, but if you're a big corporation, there's all kinds of ways the government can mess with you. Just if you want to do mergers or just just auditing you, all kinds of there's so many rules in the books. At any given moment, every major corporation is probably committing 18 felonies. Right, you know what I mean? Just the nature of just how crazy the regulations are. And so there might be some element of, if they know, especially now when the Biden administration comes in, that this is what Washington wants and we want to keep them happy, maybe it's they have to just show, oh no, we're doing this critical race theory employee training and stuff, don't hurt us. So it could be that kind of a thing too.
It's also is it possible also that the world economy or the world consumer base is so large that they could be playing also to that, and the U.S. base? Because my experience around the world, and I haven't traveled to all countries, but I have some experience in foreign countries, and I haven't found anywhere there is a considerate, sizable conservative base at all. Like Mexico, their right-wing party is left of the Democrat Party. So, I mean, the entire country is left. I started a lot of churches and had a lot of street ministry with hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps, or tens of thousands maybe. And I've never met really a conservative-minded person in Mexico. They're all left, if not socially, but fiscally, and in these areas we're talking about, as far as economics would be considered, they're all far left. And so I just wonder if they're not looking at the world consumer base and saying, we're going to play to them, and if 30% of Americans don't like it, that's a drop in the bucket to what the possible, China, India, these places are.
That could certainly be a factor, and like you said, yeah, particularly for multinational corporations that are selling all over. Yeah, that could also be a factor. And so, when I was coming up with the numbers as to which of their customers is it appealing to and which does it turn off, yeah, maybe it's more skewed the other way. One other theory I've heard, I don't know that he invented this, but Dave Smith is the guy that I heard this from first, which I thought was interesting. Was, remember, after the 2008 crisis, there was the Occupy Wall Street movement, and there was this big movement to like rail against the so-called 1%, and Bernie Sanders was big and all this stuff. And so Dave's theory is, if you're a bunch of investment bankers sitting around, you're very concerned at that point. Like, there could be left-wing populists coming in who want to install like huge taxes on the wealthy or just confiscate our stuff. And so it would be in their interest to foment racial discord, right? Like, let's change the conversation to not be about the top 1% ripping everybody off with the bailouts and all those shenanigans on Wall Street. Let's instead change the conversation to slavery and how blacks are being oppressed in this country. To take the heat off of, let's not confiscate the wealth of the top 1%. So
interesting.
That could be another possibility as to why are all these major corporations pushing this stuff, is because that distracts people from taking their assets.
Right. I thought it was interesting. I was reading your book, that was the last one I read, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism. And you have a paragraph in there dealing with discrimination in the job place, but the way we normally think of it, whereas, you're a woman or you're black or you're a Jew or whatever. But you write this, and I'll read you a quote of it, what you wrote. You say, quote, "In contrast, no matter how prejudiced he might be, Bill Gates would never decide to fire all his top software developers if they had different political views," end quote. And of course, like I say, the context is typical or traditional discrimination. And yet it seems like in this day and age, that is actually playing out opposite of as you wrote, as it pertains to if you have different political views of wokeness, you could actually be fired by Google or Bill Gates, or he's not in the company anymore, but Microsoft. I mean, there's actually people losing their jobs because they hold different political views, being discriminated against. It's very ironic.
Yeah, it is. That is funny. Yeah, certainly. Even I could sit here and try to nitpick and say, well, I said all of his people, and it was James Damore. But yeah, you're right. I would not have written that passage because it would not have rung so true today as it did back when I wrote that. When I was like, oh yeah, you wouldn't just fire somebody because they were a Republican. Whereas now, yeah, things are so.
That's what exactly. Mm-hmm. To me, that highlights the shift that I see, and it's like it's like now corporations don't seem to be acting on the same rules that they before have. At least that's the way it looks like to me. And that kind of just highlighted that, because when you wrote that, I would have read that, say, 3 years ago and thought, yeah, exactly, I agree with that 100%. And now when I look at it and put it in a different context, like, man, the world's changed a lot.
Right. And so, yeah, like I said, all I can go back to is that it's a combination of things, and I'm not sure again how much weight to give to each one, but I think part of it is the business world has changed. Like, so right now, for example, certainly in 2020, a lot of businesses, they didn't even know, depending on what the governor's whim was that week, they didn't even know if they could be open or not, because of coronavirus. And so it really does, in terms of these things about, and serving your customers or whatever, versus trying to be on the right side of whatever the political arguments of the day are, you can see how being, in good standing with the government or the authorities more generally is way more important now than it was back when I wrote that.
Yes.
In the early 2000s, because everything is just so heavily politicized, and there's so many more levers right now that the government could just literally shut you down if they decide they don't like you. And they could give some different reason. Like, they wouldn't just say, it's because you didn't put up a BLM sign in your window.
Correct.
But they could just make some arbitrary ruling that, establishments that serve food that have fewer than 16 seats, or they're such and such size, can't open right now because of coronavirus.
Yeah.
And maybe the reason they did it was just to punish this one business that was, running ads and saying how the governor's an idiot or something.
And then you also have to worry about your larger competitors. For instance, let's say Amazon can shut down your website because they control such a huge percentage of the server space. And you have Microsoft. So if Microsoft and Amazon all decide that you are promoting terrible things, they can just shut you down.
But yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up, Mike. That it's that's a whole other can of worms in terms of what to do with that. But yeah, the fact is, right now, people who, just in general, I'm sure there's lots of people who think this, transgender stuff, especially for young kids, is insane. But they will not say that on Twitter. They won't say that on Facebook because they work at a big corporation. And at the very least, they get hauled down to HR, or they might get fired if they, spoke their mind. And so it's only people who have like independent footholds at places that are allowed to speak out. And it sort of, gives the appearance that there's not many people that oppose some of these things, when I think a lot more people privately are like, yeah, this country is going in a crazy direction. But like you say, there's all these different avenues outside of mere, literal jackbooted thugs from Washington kicking in your door. There's all kinds of ways you can be punished seriously if you anger the online mob.
And then they can just simply put your voice in a void in Twitter, Facebook, anywhere you try to. Where are you going to speak? You're going to come out and say, I don't agree with dosing 8-year-olds who came out one day and said, I feel like a girl, and so we're going to dose them with hormones. And then they just, you can put that on YouTube, like I will just now, and this video will probably never be seen by anybody. And you can put it on Facebook and Twitter, and it can all be there, and you cannot be fired, and nobody will have a clue you ever said it, because it just goes off into a void where it gets shadow banned, and it's like it never was said.
Right. Yeah. So, like you say, for all these reasons, yeah, I agree. A lot of the mechanisms of, talking about, it does seem like the major corporations are not just sitting around now thinking, how do I give a better product at lower prices to my customers? There's all these other things they're worrying about. And also, we shouldn't cast them as innocent victims either. A lot of them, I think, are working with it, and some of them ideologically are totally on board with it too. So it's not that they're just being forced against their will. I think a lot of them welcome, this new regime. This kind of goes back, Mike, to what we were saying earlier, like under the New Deal, how like it was a cartelization, and so a lot of those big, labor unions and big companies benefited from that by setting this. So likewise here, I think some of these big companies realize we're going to be the ones at the table setting the agenda, and we'll be able to keep out our competitors. So it actually does benefit them, even though they're, quote, being forced to go along with the government's edicts.
Right. Real quick, before I let you go, I have a couple questions I'll see if we can get a real quick answer to. Maybe talk to you another time more in depth. But I just wanted to, libertarianism. What chance does it ever have of being a viable political party in the U.S.? Or political movement where it actually can win?
So, to me, the function of like running an LP candidate at the national level, for the president, is more of an educational one. That people like politics, it's exciting, it's sort of like a gladiator sport kind of thing. And so if you have a very eloquent, effective spokesperson who's the libertarian running for president, that can get the message out to a lot of people. Like a lot of people nowadays, when they're libertarians or Austrians, and you ask them, how'd you get into this stuff? They say, oh, Ron Paul. So it was when he was running as a Republican is when he really broke out. But so to me, that's the function. I don't see anytime soon at the federal level, libertarians as a political party getting into major office. So state and local, there might be more gains that way. But so I personally, and that's why I personally don't get into libertarians with a capital L. Like I wish them well and everything. I know Dave Smith is my friend and he's doing stuff, so I wish him well. But that's personally why I don't get into that so much, is because I'm more concerned with educating people, because I think that's where my efforts are best spent, is just teaching the public these principles.
Bitcoin. Should people be into Bitcoin? Because there's all kinds of criticism right now. People are saying it's the tulip, the tulip bubble, and the beanie bag, beanie whatever thing bubble, the beanie bear, whatever those things are called. Is that the case with Bitcoin? How do you see it?
So in terms of just understanding how it works, I wrote a guide with a co-author a while ago. So if people go to understandingbitcoin.us, they can see that. And it's, we assume you know nothing, and then take it to whatever depth you want in terms of understanding how the thing works, if you're just curious.
I'll put that link in the description so people can find that.
Okay. And then, but yeah, so I own some. I think for people who are worried about the collapse of the dollar, it makes sense to own, gold and silver, in your own physical possession. But also, yeah, I own some Bitcoin for that reason. The tulips, people have said several times now that, oh, Bitcoin's dead. Like every time it drops 20%, everyone's like, oh, see, it's dead, but it keeps going back up. And so, if it just keeps doing that, well, yeah, then it's good. It's good to hold. So not rendering financial advice, but I'll put it this way. I would be shocked if 10 years from now, Bitcoin does not have a higher price measured in US dollars than it does right now. So it might go up and down dramatically along the way. So it's not, it's very volatile. I wouldn't put all your money into it, but to have it as a small portion of your portfolio as a hedge against, the dollar crashing, I think that makes a lot of sense.
I find it interesting in my portfolio that whenever the stocks are down, my crypto is up, and it keeps everything up to now. I mean, again, I don't render any financial advice either. I just find it interesting that I can almost know what crypto is doing in my portfolio by seeing what the stocks are doing, and vice versa. It's very strange.
That's generally one counterexample of that, though, was back in March of 2020 when the coronavirus panic hit. I would have thought going into that Bitcoin would go up. Everyone's panicked and they're going to go into gold, and actually Bitcoin went down. And I talked to some of the aficionados, and they were saying, oh yeah, that just proves, because it's so liquid, that in times of crisis, you can turn to your Bitcoin and sell that to get dollars to go do what you need to do. And okay, fair enough. But anyway, I'm just saying that that did give me pause, that I would have thought going into that there's a global crisis, Bitcoin shoots up, but actually it went down.
That's interesting.
Now, having said that, Bitcoin has gone way up since then.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I had Bitcoin through the whole thing. But I'm just mentioning.
Yeah. Okay. One more thing, I'll let you go. Capitalism. Does it create inequality? Does it dispossess the bottom 10%? This is, AKA Jordan Peterson he promotes capitalism, and yet his criticism is that we all accept it creates inequality. Is that true? Do you see that as being a true statement?
Sure. Yeah. Properly understood. I mean, capitalism unleashes people to create wealth, and some people are more productive than others. And so, yes, if some people create way more wealth, and partly the incentive structure to how do you motivate them to do that is they get to retain it, then when you unleash this system and then come back a year later and look at it, some people are going to have more than others. But that makes the poorest people wealthier than they otherwise would have been too. So it's like under capitalism, the rich get richer and the poor get richer. And so the question is, would you, if you're a poor person right now, what do you want to know? That 10 years from now, your standard of living is going to be a lot higher, or that you're going to be about the same as you are, but other people aren't going to be much better either? And so, I think that's what, and you could look at it in sports or anything too. Like in sports, it's true that, wow, there's a select few players who score the majority of the points. And is that fair or not? And it's not that there's a given number of points and we're going to distribute them. It's no, people create the points they go score. And the same thing with capitalism and wealth creation.
In your metaphor, it is that teams that have a couple guys that score a lot of points, their teammates tend to score more points than they otherwise would.
Right, yeah.
Because they're freed up. Everyone's attacking the Michael Jordan, and so a guy that wouldn't score that much can sit out on the perimeter and score a lot more than he ever would.
Right, exactly.
in your
And then,
metaphor.
right, yes, yeah, exactly. So yes, the issue is, yeah, are we trying to win this game or not? And then, what do we do? And so likewise, yeah, if the goal is we want to unleash human productivity and creativity and let people create as much as possible. And again, like you said, like one last thing I'll say on this too is when we talk about like, oh, but it's so unfair that, Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or whatever, they're multi-billionaires, and it's not like they just have a bunch of mansions. Mostly when we say that they're worth billions of dollars, what that mostly is shares of stock in the companies they founded. And so if you just took it from them and gave it, all you would be doing is redistributing control over what Microsoft does or Amazon does. And then those companies would be running to the ground because most people don't know anything about those industries.
Yes,
So
Musk is a really good example of that, in that he is almost entirely, his wealth is in stock in his companies. He's sold all his houses, I think, or pretty much, or most of them, and he's gotten rid of. He sleeps in the office a lot, is what I read. But I mean, he's a real good example of what you're saying. It's like, oh, he has all these billions of dollars. Well, people think that he's like rolling around in it naked at night, and that's not at all what that wealth really is.
Right, exactly. So yeah, obviously the stuff they do have, they got jets and whatever, they're
Sure.
living a nice lifestyle. Don't get me wrong, but you're right. It's this idea that, oh, why don't we just take it from them and give to other people? That wouldn't All that would do is destroy the value that Amazon and Microsoft or whoever give to us, And so and then also, what incentive would people have to go start the next multi-billion-dollar company if they know if it gets too successful, they're just going to come and take it away from me?
Yes. All right. Well, time's up, I guess. I would hopefully get you on another time. I got a whole lot more things I wanted to get to and talk with you about, but this has been great. I really appreciate you taking this time. I know you're very busy. I appreciate your books. I enjoy reading them. I recommend them to my church and to homeschoolers in our church. And I'll put the links to all those things, and hopefully they'll go out and get some copies of those and read them and and become even more informed. And I appreciate what you do very much. And thank you for taking the time and talk to me.
But thanks so much for having me, Mike. This was a pleasure.
All right. You take care, Robert, and God bless you, sir.